Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Nikki Lefebvre, and I am the Executive Director of the Natick Historical Society. We were established in 1870, and today we remain an independent nonprofit that really thrives on the support of community members. And I want to extend my thanks to all of you who support the Natick Historical Society and make so much of our work possible, including free admission to our museum, free talks, book clubs, walking tours, and more. And I will also note, because we're in the throes of preparation for it, field trips to the museum for all third graders in Natick public schools, offered at no cost to Natick families. Tonight, though, I also want to add a special thanks to our program sponsors, Frank and Emily Honeywell. A big thanks to both of you, Frank and Emily, for your generosity in making this particular program possible for us to bring historian Brenna Greer and her work to the community. So a silent round of applause for our program sponsors. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here this evening with historian Brenna Greer. Before I introduce her, though, I want to highlight a few upcoming events. On Saturday, March 16th at 11 a.m., we will be having an event as part of a new series we'll call Conversations on Collections. And the first topic is repatriation and return in small museums. And I will be speaking at that event, and alongside me will be Jose Villamat, who is an assistant curator for NAGPRA and also serves on our collections committee at the Natick Historical Society. On Saturday, April 6th, we will be having a community map day. So we will have 24 or so maps out all over the museum. We welcome you to come in, browse around, see if you can find your house, the school you grew up attending, a favorite spot in Natick, and we'll have a few sort of local map experts on hand to chat with about the maps too. Should be fun, light refreshments available, so mark your calendars for that. And also want to let everybody know that our spring walking tour schedule is coming. So we will be posting that in a week or two. We'll announce tours of Natick Center, South Natick, and Walnut Hill. And each of those walking tours is free. All are welcome. And you can find out about any of these programs on our website, www.natickhistoricalsociety.org. So it's my delight now to introduce Brenna Greer. Dr. Greer is a social, cultural, and book historian whose research focuses on the relationship between race, citizenship, capitalism, and visual culture. As an associate professor in the Department of History at Wellesley College, she teaches a range of topics, including World War II, the Cold War, the modern Black freedom struggle, visual culture, Black print culture, consumerism and capitalism, and even fashion. As a scholar and an educator, she's committed to illuminating histories, the understanding of which is necessary to eliminating present-day barriers to racial justice and social equality. Dr. Greer is an award-winning teacher and historian, and her research has been supported by a number of prominent organizations, including the Rare Books School, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. She and her work have been featured in various media spaces, including podcasts, academic journals, and major publications such as the New York Times, the Daily Mail, and The Nation. Currently, she's working on a book about the emergence of the Black magazine publishing industry after World War II, as well as the role of popular Black magazines in African Americans' lives. Thank you, Dr. Greer, for being with us tonight. And now I'll just offer a final reminder to be sure you're viewing the presentation in speaker view, and ideally side-by-side mode, I think is the best way to do that. So without further ado, let's give Dr. Greer a warm but silent Zoom round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki. Nikki and I were talking before you all came in about how long it's been since we've really done a Zoom event. And so I may be a little clunky. We were dealing with things beforehand. So I'm just really glad, though, to be here. And I want to thank those of you who have come out, as it were. And I need to say again, thank you to Nikki and to the programming committee for, just inviting me to do this. And then, as Nikki said, a very special thank you to Emily and Frank Honeywell, who, for their generosity in sponsoring this event. And then I also want to thank Marge Balcom, because if not for her, I probably wouldn't actually be as tightly connected to the Native Historical Society. Nikki was my first contact, and that, gave me warm feelings about the society, but I didn't imagine I would be so connected to it. But about a year after I met Nikki, Marge emailed me. I didn't know her at all, to ask if we could meet for coffee to talk about something that we might do for Black History Month. And we did meet for coffee, and it may not be a surprise to any of you, we did not talk about doing something for Black History Month. Instead, she asked me to be on the board. And yes, and I could not, even though I didn't know her, I just couldn't refuse her. So, and I really am actually thankful for that. That was a gift that she gave to me, even if I didn't necessarily know it at the time. So again, I want to thank her for what she brought into my life. So, and I am really grateful to Nikki and the programming committee, because they allowed me to push this talk into March. As an African-American historian who specializes in African-American history, you might imagine that my Februaries are fairly busy. However, that's kind of ironic, because actually I have a lot of conflicted feelings about Black History Month, which people don't generally assume. And I should say that I have feelings or conflicted feelings about how it's generally observed, right? Who and what we celebrate. And I think that what we do is, as a society, as a culture, we celebrate a chosen few of select Black icons, really, rather than allowing for a celebration or honoring or recognition of, complex experiences of complex people in this nation's history that aren't necessarily iconic or don't rise to that level. And if you need convincing of the fact that Black History Month is really dedicated to a chosen few, I would have you look at this image. Every February, I do a Google image search of Black History Month, of the term Black History Month. Every February, it returns something like this, right? And so, from my view, this collage of collages reflects the general interest and also general knowledge of Black history that we share. Now, having said all of that, I'm sure you're thinking, wait a minute, isn't the focus of your talk on Rosa Parks? Isn't she one of the chosen few? Which absolutely she is. There she is in almost every single one of those collages, I think, except maybe 2 or 3, right? And in every one of those assemblages, they testify to the fact that Rosa Parks is inarguably one of, if not the most celebrated of all historical Black figures, second maybe to Martin Luther King Jr. And I certainly don't begrudge her place in history or the recognition that she receives during February. She deserves it. But as she's typically celebrated, it becomes clear that Rosa Parks is also one of the most misunderstood Black figures. As a culture, we've come to value and I think evoke Rosa Parks as more a symbol than an agent of history. And as a result, we have very little understanding of her actual historical significance. So what? Why does it matter? Well, for one, I think most of us don't like ignorance in others or ourselves, but more importantly, our collective ignorance, combined with the power of what I call the symbolic Rosa Parks, which I'll be referring to throughout, I think this presents Black Americans with real challenges in our present day freedom struggles. And I'm gonna try and demonstrate that to you or explain it to you. So I want to be very clear by what I mean by the symbolic Rosa Parks. In her most iconic, most symbolic or iconic form, Rosa Parks is the mother of the Civil Rights Movement, an honorific that stems from her arrest on December 1st, 1955, for refusing to relinquish her seat to a white man on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And that action then prompted 95% of Black Montgomery to quit riding the buses, which they did for over a year. Now, I chose this picture as representative of Parks in her symbolic form, because although Parks was merely 42 years old at the time of her arrest, which I want to stress is not old, this is an image of Parks that I grew up with. I was led to believe that Parks was an elderly woman who refused to get up because her feet were tired after a long day of work. And then in her exhaustion, she took a stand by sitting down or by remaining seated. And I held on to this image of Parks all the way through college and well into graduate school. And only when I started researching Montgomery on my own did that image begin to crumble. Now, as one who teaches history every year for almost, or teaches African-American history every year for almost 2 decades now, I constantly wrestle with the symbolic Rosa Parks in the classroom, as well as other members of the Black Saints and Martyrs set, as I call them, to which she belongs. Regardless of race or education, the vast majority of students that I teach enter college knowing only the symbolic Rosa Parks, right? The vast majority of them, again, she becomes a paper doll for them, and they only recognize her in the one outfit that she comes with. And it's a representation that's as simplistic as it is inaccurate. And so why is this the case? And I ask because historians have been piecing together a much more complicated and useful record of Rosa Parks for almost 40 years now, of her as an activist and as a woman. And I'd point you in particular to these 2 books, written by Daniel McGuire and Jean Theo Harris, which examine Parks' life and activism well beyond outside of the Montgomery bus boycott and into the 70s and 80s. And these studies demonstrate definitively that Rosa Parks was a lifelong activist who fought for African-American civil rights and fought against sexual violence, particularly sexual violence against Black women. And as Theo Harris's title implies, she was quite radical in her activism. So then the question becomes, what accounts for symbolic Rosa Parks? Where did she come from? Why does she persist? And why does that matter? So I'm going to use the rest of my time to, 1, argue that photography played a significant role in constructing and popularizing the symbolic Rosa Parks. And 2, I'm going to consider the role of iconic photographs that emerged from the civil rights movement in shaping, and their role in shaping the narrative about Rosa Parks and the larger Black freedom struggle. And now there are going to be some images that may be jarring to some viewers or some of those of you in the audience that are civil rights movement images, nothing graphic, but I just want to put that out there because it is, about segregationists being upset with Black protesters. So this photograph was taken on December 21st, 1956. So that's a year and some after Parks was arrested. And it marks the day that Blacks in Montgomery went back on the buses after the Supreme Court affirmed that segregated buses were unconstitutional. Now, technically, the photograph is a product of the white media in that it was taken by a white photographer on behalf of an agency of the white press. But the image is also very much a Black creation, one that marked a culminating moment in a continual and collective effort among Blacks participating in the bus boycott to promote an image or a public image of Parks as a genteel woman, and most importantly, as an accidental activist. Because doing so at that time was the most politically expedient and safe. And it's important to understand that no one was more essential to the cultivation or the framing of symbolic Rosa Parks than Rosa herself. Parks's transformation into a symbolic figure began in earnest on December 5th, 1955. So that's 4 days after her arrest. And that's also the first day of the bus boycott. That evening, much of Black Montgomery gathered at the Holt Street Baptist Church for one of what would be many mass meetings during the boycott. And of course, Parks was there, although she did not say anything. From the pulpit, as pictured here, a then 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. praised Parks, remarking on the height of her character and the depth of her Christian commitment. Parks, he said, was, quote, a person that nobody can call a disturbing factor in the community. Now, in pronouncing Parks to be not disturbing, King planted the seeds from which the iconic Parks grew. His comment is all the more significant because while Parks was absolutely respected and even respectable, she was most definitely a disturbing figure in the community by virtue of her activism, through which she consistently transgressed against contemporary race and gender expectations, particular to the South, the Jim Crow South, and she challenged white power structures. And just to give you a sense of that, decades before her arrest, she was making a career of asserting and protecting African-American civil rights in particular. So I'll demonstrate that. In the early 1930s, Rosa Parks and her husband Raymond organized on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys, who were 9 Black men accused of raping 2 white women in Scottsboro, Alabama. And when that group of organizers or that group of protesters met at Parks's home, Rosa Parks stood as the lookout. And she said, "I've never seen so many guns on a table in my life." In 1943, Parks formalized her activism when she joined the local NAACP chapter, becoming only the 3rd woman to do so. The other 2 women were her mother and her high school best friend, Johnny Carr. And she was very active in her NAACP membership. She immediately became secretary to chapter president Edie Nixon, and she formed the Montgomery NAACP Youth Council, which educated Black youth about their civil rights. But most impressive to me, or jarring to me, is that she traveled around the state of Alabama interviewing Blacks who had witnessed or experienced white on Black brutality. And she did this alone in the 40s in the South. And most notably in 1944, she investigated the case of Recy Taylor, who was a 24-year-old woman who was abducted and raped by white men. And in an effort to get justice for Taylor, Parks formed the Committee for Equal Justice of Recy Taylor and wrote state representatives to act on her behalf, act on Taylor's behalf. And then in 1948, Parks became the first secretary of the newly formed Alabama State Conference of the NAACP, which publicized her activism beyond Montgomery. As state secretary, Parks spoke at the 1948 NAACP State Convention, where she declared from the stage, quote, "No one should feel proud as long as Negroes are intimidated." Also in the 40s, she made repeated attempts to vote, which certainly brought her to the attention of segregationist city officials, and not in a good way. And then in August of 1955, she began a decades-long relationship with the Highlander Folk School, which was a leadership training school in Tennessee. And due to its integrated programs and its leftist politics, Highlander was routinely targeted as a communist organization. And segregationists tried to malign and discredit Dr. King on the basis of his relationship with that school. But I'll ask you to notice who's also there. All of this is to say that whatever her intentions or motivations, Rosa Parks was a disturbing factor. And in fact, she seemingly worked at it. Thus, she could not easily claim to be the non-controversial innocent that King's comments suggested. And as others have argued, women like Parks, who were, quote, conspicuously active in political and civic life, presented a serious challenge to post-war gender ideas, and therefore a serious liability to Black political movements in that time. So Parks's symbolic role as boycott heroine required perception of her as a lady wronged, rather than a fervent combatant of Jim Crow. And it was an idea that couldn't be assumed. It had to be performed, publicized, promoted repeatedly. And photographs taken throughout the boycott were essential to this project. There are no photographs of Parks from the day that she was arrested. Often people mistake this photograph for the mugshot resulting from her arrest. But in fact, this photograph was taken when Parks was indicted in 1956, February 1956, for violating an anti-boycott statute, which was a desperate attempt by city officials to break the boycott. And I appreciate this image because it captures how Rosa Parks dressed the part of middle-class ladyhood throughout the boycott. It's important to remember that as a decidedly working class woman, it was Parks's consummate skills as a tailor, she did not like being called a seamstress, as a tailor that allowed her to produce, literally, the clothing essential to her role, especially since she and her husband both lost their jobs in that they were fired following her arrest. Now, testifying to the attention she paid to her attire, years later, Parks remembered precisely the outfit that she put together for her first court appearance on December 5th, 1955. She says, I wore a straight long sleeve black dress with a white collar and cuffs, a small black velvet hat with pearls across the top, and a charcoal gray coat, she recalled. I carried a black purse and wore white gloves. Now, for her mugshot, she paired that same small black velvet hat with a perfectly tailored chiton dressmaker suit. And it was this outfit that made the front page of the New York Times. Now, I find this particular photograph to be significant when considering popular narratives of Parks and the bus boycott. And I know some will think that I'm stretching this. But for one, it mainstreamed Parks as a representative of the Black Montgomery and their cause in the preferred image of being cooperative and genteel. And to that point, she was the Negro seamstress, Negro seamstress. And here she was publicized to the world, in fact. I also think that this photograph may contribute to notions of Parks as elderly. Of the options available, editors of the Times chose the photograph in which Parks's neck is most craned to the side, which caused wrinkles along the side of her face that make her look older than she was. Notably, they also propped out the white man seated behind Parks. You can see here. Seated behind Parks, whose presence and gaze established Parks as being in a decidedly white and not entirely friendly space. But the most important function of this photograph, in both its content and its circulation, is that it divorced Parks from her activist peers, 114 of which were also indicted on that same day for violating the anti-boycott statute. Now, these two images belie the true nature of Rosa Parks' life as a member of the working class and sometimes of the working poor, who certainly was not dressed in this manner when she was arrested following a full day of work in men's alterations at the Montgomery Fair department store. And again, circulating on their own, these images isolate Parks from the networks of organizing and activism to which she belonged, which makes histories of the boycott and Rosa Parks' role in it much less useful, if not useless. Which is not to say that photographs of Parks don't have tremendous value. To the contrary, for one, they reveal tactics that Parks and Black Montgomery used during their protest. At least they do if you've looked at a lot of them over time. And this is important because Black Montgomery waged one of the most successful social movements in US history. So it behooves us, or at least African Americans, to understand how they pulled off what they did. Now, one example is that photographs during the bus boycott captured an important aspect of Parks's performance, which was her position in relationship to men. Understand that Parks's paid work, her activism kept her out of the home and apart from her husband. That, combined with the fact that she had no children, was a potential liability to her acceptance as a sympathetic victim of Jim Crow. Consequently, throughout the boycott, Parks rarely appeared in public without a man at her side. And this strategy anticipated accusations commonly levied at women who circulated through public spaces alone or without the accompaniment of men, which included allegations of promiscuity, hypersexuality, homosexuality, and any one of which would have canceled out Parks's symbolic value. Not surprisingly, then, numerous photographs of Parks during the boycott saw her in scenarios that implied her dependence on or deference to male authority. And as a collective, these images contradict a life in which Parks commonly eschewed male authority, especially white male authority, acted independently, and was often the primary and sometimes the sole breadwinner in her home. Now, along those lines, interestingly, in all the years I've researched the Montgomery bus boycott, I've found one photograph of Parks and her husband, Raymond Parks, and he's escorting her to court that day that she's indicted. Now, there are several possible explanations for this. Perhaps, as some implied, Raymond Parks was an alcoholic, which would sully the ideal and image under construction. Or maybe Rosa Parks or her representatives feared that her husband's extensive past activism would be used to condemn her. Or perhaps they understood that picturing Rosa with her husband would not highlight male authority, but rather reveal Raymond Parks's compromised ability as a Black man to do what his wife had done. And so now I come back to this photograph, and I should, just as an aside, point to the fact that it was primarily women who resisted segregation on the buses because it was safer to do so. However, and they also rode the buses more. However, many times they were, their resistance was met with violence and they're being jailed. So, but again, coming back to this photograph, of all the photographs taken of Parks during the boycott and in fact her entire life, none has been more important than this one photograph, particularly to the promotion and perpetuation of the symbolic Rosa Parks. As I said earlier, this photograph was taken the morning the bus boycott ended. Contemporary viewers, in many sense, have assumed the photograph was the happy accident of a photographer in the right place at the right time. But in fact, it was completely staged. That morning, reporters tracked down Parks after following King and other reverends around for a while. They tracked her down at her home in the Cleveland Court Projects, and they cajoled her into coming downtown where, as she later recalled, quote, they had her get on and off buses so they could take pictures. Meaning this image was a collaboration between Parks and members of the white press. And to create the scene, Parks took a seat by herself toward the front of the bus and gazed out the window. The pose deliberately evoked her supposed calm on the day of her arrest. And then Nicholas Chris, a reporter of the United Press Atlanta Bureau, took the seat behind her. His role, as he explained later, was to appear as both a random passenger and, quote, the sullen white segregationist, begrudgingly forced to accept desegregation on the public buses in Montgomery. Now, once Parks and Chris were in place, an unidentified photographer, a UPI photographer, took a position on the stairs at the front of the bus, and he took what was to become the most iconic photograph of Rosa Parks. And then the following week, Time magazine, the #1 news magazine of that moment, published the photograph with the caption, quote, "Jim Crow will never be the same." And notice that the tight crop, the layered, or the layout editors applied, emphasized the close proximity between Chris and Parks. And that therefore emphasized the tremendous upset to what white Southerners had euphemistically referred to for a long time as their way of life. Then the Black press picked up the image, including newspapers, Jet magazine, which was the second most popular Black magazine with a circulation of 400,000 weekly, and the NAACP's The Crisis. This photograph of Parks represents then a culminating act in Parks's year-long performance of what I call not disturbing Blackness, even as the photograph documents a great disturbance. Through her performance, Parks captured the white media to interject a rare image of Black triumph, even superiority, into mainstream visual culture, an image that smuggled along with it a radical vision of social change. And this I find remarkable. In the decades since, this photograph has circulated countless times over in textbooks, newspapers, and exhibits, to the extent that Parks described it as, quote, her symbol shot. And this I find problematic, because ripped from context, I think this image works symbiotically with the popular narrative of Rosa Parks as a genteel and tired woman who broke character on that bus. Ripped from context, this photograph is a study in containment. In it, Parks's dress, comportment, and countenance all work to visually confine her within the frame. The large winter coat that Parks wears appears to both wrap her up and weigh her down. The hair that would not fit under Parks's hat is disciplined in a large but tidy bun. Parks sits straight up with her hands clasped in her lap. Her facial expression contributes to a picture of quietude. Soberly, she stares out the window with her mouth firmly closed. She embodies silence. And her relation to the camera contributes to an image of her as non-threatening because she looks out the window. Her face is turned away from the photographer and the only other person visible in the photo, the white man seated behind her. Consequently, she does not engage or confront the viewer or anyone in her visible context. In this seated, still, and silent form, Rosa Parks appears very regal, but also very not disturbing. And this photograph belongs to a series of iconic photojournalistic images that emerged from and document civil rights activists' nonviolent direct action. In fact, the performance of Blackness enshrined in Rosa Parks' symbol shot appears again and again in subsequent civil rights protests. You see it in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, when 9 Black teenagers attempted to integrate Central High. You see it in the sit-ins that Black college students stage at lunch counters throughout the South, in 1960. And then again in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, when stoic Black children formed the front line in a nonviolent integration campaign. And then in Selma in 1965, as civil rights activists marched on behalf of voting rights. As intended, the nonviolent direct action captured in these photos provoked anti-democratic white violence, visuals of which compelled passage of crucial civil rights legislation. And as an archive, these images constitute the foundation, if not the entirety, of many Americans' understanding of the civil rights movement. That was true for me. And this can be problematic because isolated from the Jim Crow policies and practices, Black image politics and specific agendas from which these images emerged, these images read to many as representations of Black passivity or powerlessness. Similarly, with the symbol shot, even as it commemorates and honors Black courage, this photograph functions as a portrait of Black civility, of benign Blackness, which has proven to be extremely popular. This is hands down the most famous and reproduced photograph of Parks. According to her, it was the photograph that children from all over the world sent to her most to have her autograph, such that then she then termed it her, quote, historical badge of honor. But more than that, as cultural studies scholar Nicole Fleetwood has said, this image is, quote, one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century, period. What explains this? Well, for one, as an image, it fulfills basic requirements of the icon, in that many recognize and understand it on a deep and even reassuring level. When Rosa Parks passed in 2005, the iconicity of the image and its centrality to the public's conception of her became crystal clear when Apple marked her passing by making this image the centerpiece of its homepage. Now, I think this mashup demonstrates that as one of the most revered representations of Black citizenship, the symbol shot image has come to function actually more as a brand of Blackness, a brand against which other performances and representations of Blackness, and especially Black protest, are judged, and often harshly. Most obviously, perhaps, are those images put forward by advocates of Black power or the protest of advocates of Black power. So take, for instance, this publicity photo of Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. No less contrived than the symbol shot, this photograph is the antithesis of the idea presented by the symbol shot. The only similarities are that the Black activists in both photographs are seated. Otherwise, Newton is pictured separate from white people, brandishing instruments of battle and surrounded by stereotypical symbols of not just Blackness, but Africanness. Moreover, he is smack dab in the center of the picture, and he does not look away. This representational strategy runs through many photographs the Panthers engineered, and ultimately, it is in large part responsible for the Panthers being targeted and then effectively suppressed in short order by the state. In the image of Blackness and Black protests they projected, the Panthers had stepped out of bounds determined by the image and ideal of symbolic Rosa Parks, which I hope I have managed to convince you are inextricably linked. The Panthers and many activists since proved too disturbing, which I argue is in part because an endearing legacy of the symbol shot and its representation of Parks as a paragon of polite protest is that it has elevated polite protest as good and therefore acceptable Black protest, which may account for why so often when Black Americans do protest, even when they're not engaged in violence or the destruction of property, we are characterized as criminal, dangerous, ungrateful, and unworthy. And why so often the manner in which Black Americans protest becomes the grounds upon which the legitimacy of our grievances are determined. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenna. I think I'm probably hearing a silent Zoom round of applause and want to add my own thanks to that. I'm sort of taking a breath after the final lines. I do want to open it up for Q&A, and I will ask that if you have a question, you can drop it directly to me in the chat, and I will put that to Brenna. I know to get us started here, Brenna, can I ask this focus on symbolic parks, has it obscured sort of other aspects of her activism or protests? For example, the Montgomery bus boycott. Can you sort of talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah. The ability to speak. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when making this presentation or this talk, I was just like, take that out, take that out. You don't have enough time to do that. So I only took Rosa Parks up to the Montgomery bus boycott, but you will see her at all of the kind of national or nationally covered protests thereafter of the civil rights movement, including the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's the part that's always forgotten in 1963. And then she was also present at the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. I think what might be most surprising to people is that she was not a proponent of nonviolence. She actually, her hero was Malcolm X. And that is the thing that people find out, which is most jarring to them, which tells you how much work her image, which she enacted, how much that performance has just settled a particular idea in our minds. She also protested apartheid. She continued to fight for Black women and against sexual violence towards them throughout her life up until she developed dementia. And then as for the bus boycott, there's so much. She should be very central to it, but there's so much that by focusing on her, we just don't know about the bus boycott. And then again, I think that makes it fairly useless as a history, because histories are supposed to be about informing us in the present. And so the bus boycott, we don't have any idea of the number of women, the other women that were involved. And this was a protest, a boycott, a movement that was led, that was made and maintained by women throughout. They sold, baked goods and sandwiches to put fuel in the cars. They made the sandwiches for the mass meetings. They ran the switchboard for the carpool that Blacks in Montgomery organized, so that they wouldn't ride Black taxis either. I'm sorry, white taxis. And then perhaps most importantly, Joanne Robinson, she was the leader of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, and she is actually responsible for kicking the boycott off, because when Parks was arrested on the night of, when she was arrested on December 1st, Joanne Robinson got word of it, and the men, her husband and Edie Nixon, and were all trying to figure out whether or not she should be a test case. And Joanne and Rosa Parks agreed to do that. But Joanne Robinson, she went to her school. She was a teacher at Alabama State. Trying to think if that was the right name, which was a historically Black college. And she got some of her students. She mimeographed off a bunch of leaflets, just hundreds of leaflets, calling for a boycott the following Monday, which was the first day that Rosa Parks would go to court. And then they just blanketed Black Montgomery with it. And nobody knew where they came from. The white newspaper at that time is like, where did these come from? And Robinson couldn't come forward because she works at an institution that, relies on white patronage or white funds. So we don't learn about her until the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
And then Parks is just kind of this vacuum. And again, I do not begrudge her. The bigger vacuum to Parks is Dr. King, who, the women in the boycott said repeatedly, like, he is not our leader. We did this ourselves. And perhaps maybe the really important thing is that the bus boycott didn't actually desegregate the buses. It was actually a case that 4 Black women who had been violently treated when they resisted segregation on the buses prior to Rosa Parks, but who were dismissed as test cases. Those 4 women filed the case, which eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and that actually desegregated public buses throughout the nation. So nobody knows about them. That case is Browder versus Gale, and these were women that were considered way too disturbing, and not as respectable. So I really like to put their name out there over and over again.
Love that. I love the not disturbing quote is such a great conceptual framework for looking at this. That's so I have some other questions coming in here, and one is did Rosa Parks express any regret or hesitation about this manufacture of herself and the symbolic parks? 'Cause clearly she was part of it.
Right.
Did she
Right.
ever at any point sort of second guess that?
No.
I think that's the gist of the question.
Question. Yeah, she didn't ever, express regret about it. I think sometimes she regretted her role in the boycott because, she and her family, or she and her husband, had to move out of Montgomery. They did not have money. They could not get jobs after that. But she never, to my knowledge, expressed, and in fact, never really rebuffed that idea. If she had interviews, she would share that the fact that Malcolm X was her hero actually came out in a book that Douglas Brinkley published on her, a kind of very accessible biography. And since then, that is repeated over and over, but it is true. But she never really rebuffed the image. And I don't know if that's, in fact, essentially all presidential candidates, at least Democrats, have at some point pulled her up on the stage when she was still alive, and she never speaks. She never speaks. They just bring her out, hold up her hand, and then she's ushered
And
out.
off she goes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that I don't know if she understood the work that Image was doing, right? Or that she was of value, just even as I always tell my students, if you're gonna rip something down, you have to put something in its place. And so to rip Rosa Parks down and not provide any information about her and her activism in something sense, that's just mean, right? But I think that perhaps she understood her cultural symbolic role.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So can you tell us more about the white man seated behind Rosa Parks in the photo? I think, was he sort of friendly to the movement? Was he meant to be symbolic of those against the movement? Um, who is he?
Yeah, he was a reporter, and he just happened to be on the scene. And the photographer, who was also from the United Press, but not the same bureau, asked him to, and when you see him in the pictures with Rosa Parks, he's smiley, they have conversations and everything. So then he gets on the bus, and he is meant to symbolize, opponents, the segregationists, right? But he does not appear. There's only like one interview out there, after someone found out it was him. There's only one interview, and in that interview, he really just he just says that it was his role to be the sullen white segregationist. But there's no sense that he was against the movement, but there's no evidence that he was involved in the movement or support. He was there as a reporter.
Oh, interesting to be the sort of secondary to one of the most
Right.
reproduced photographs of the 20th century. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
fascinating. And so another question here about the famous image of Sojourner Truth, and
Mhm.
how does that foreshadow Park's kind of symbolic image? Would you consider that in kind of a tradition, or how would you, what can you
I'm
perhaps?
laughing, I'm smiling so much because I'm teaching a class on Black print culture and Black images, or Black people in images. And we just got done talking about looking at many photos of Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And so the photograph that I think we most see is actually from a series of photographs that was taken during a photo op, essentially, during a photo shoot, around the time that um, her slave narrative was published in 1850, which I have to say, I never even knew she had a slave narrative. So that's something I'm still working on. And so there was a series of these photographs, and then photographs after kind of took the same form. And I do think one of the things that's been really interesting to me in looking at all these pictures is how often Black activists are seated. I don't know what to make of that. Um, and I should say how often Black activists, this might be the key, how often Black activists that we celebrate are seated. All the images of Douglass are seated. He's seated. He takes a lot of studio portraits. He understands the value of photography. Sojourner Truth is actually, in some of them, she is standing, but she's always standing next to a table with some ornate things on it, and with knitting, she's knitting or sewing. So I do think I'm very interested in the trajectory there, because it does seem either, it's informing how Rosa Parks and other activists since have, comported themselves, or there's something about the racism or the protests that is just compelling that type of posture, pose,
Yeah,
performance. So yeah, but
yeah.
there's so many pictures of Sojourner Truth. It's really fascinating. And there's 166 pictures of Frederick Douglass, if you're curious.
That's a lot of portraits,
He
right?
is,
And purposeful portraits.
yeah, he was the most photographed man, any race of the 19th century. So he worked at it.
And sort of on that note, this is a fairly shameless plug that on Juneteenth we'll be reading
Oh, yeah.
Frederick Douglass. And so if you want to hear more from Brenna about Frederick Douglass, and his resonance past and present, that'll be that, mark that date on your calendars. So Brenna, I wonder if you can offer us just some commentary about, why, right? Thinking back to your first slide,
Mhm.
why these figures? Why are some people elevated above others,
Yeah.
and so consistently, and
Yeah.
we can't get away from it? Um,
I
yeah.
think there are several reasons. And I talk about this a lot with my students, or they talk a lot about it with me, because none of them know any civil rights history when they come to college, which is always I just keep thinking some year they're going to come in and I'm going to tell them some of this stuff and they're going to be like, Professor Greer, we know. And that's never the case. It's never the case. So I think some of it is just what, you know, what just keeps being trotted out in terms of what they're getting in, you know, elementary to high school. And I think that's very structural. It's not necessarily about racism or malice there. My husband is a high school teacher and he never has time. So if he doesn't know something, if that's not something you've been educated in, you're probably going to fall back on the benign figures, which are safe and or which you know, they might be the only figures that you know. But I also think one of my students pointed this out to me just the other day, and I never thought about it, which is embarrassing. If I went back to those collages, you would notice that whatever colors are on the collage, the photographs of the people are always in black and white. They're just always in black and white. And I'm still chewing on what that means. But, you know, I'll just say, these are safe figures. They're safe figures, they're freedom fighters, you know, they're heroic, you know, so that just creates this, you know, to have many, many heroic Black figures is not any more helpful than having, you know, just picture after picture or image or idea of enslaved Blacks either. They're just flat paper dolls, you know, they don't allow others to relate to Black people because there's nothing there to relate to.
And so in these educational spaces, you know, is there a pathway forward? You know, is there a step forward toward bringing more complicated, complex stories to,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, that's a different question, right? Depending on who the audience is, I suspect. But, you know, what is the step forward for the teacher who's like rushing to get to the AP US history exam and can only teach one person per movement? Is the solution outside the traditional structure? Yeah, what would you?
Perhaps, you know, because and which is a problem because you
Yeah,
don't know what you don't know, right?
right.
And so, you know, at the very least, it would be wonderful if I always say in my classes, like, I don't teach this thing because I'm not trained in it. And if it's very like, I don't teach the Holocaust in depth because I'm not trained in it. And so the class is really a part of that. There are all sorts of things that I teach that I'm not trained in or versed in, but they're not so loaded. And I think that that is probably what happens for a lot of teachers. They just don't want to go in that territory, but they could at least, you know, admit that and then
Yeah.
also encourage, you know, students to go to their parents to look for this information elsewhere. I mean, I think in the classroom, what is most helpful is not to provide answers, but to just explode them with questions. Just, you know,
Yeah.
just, and that's the thing that usually has them mad, but also makes them go find out more information. I will say, because you brought it up, I think the AP history exam is actually very detrimental to these types of histories or complex histories. So I just put that out there. And
Yeah.
the answer isn't going to be the same for every educational system, right? In the
Yeah.
public school, a teacher doesn't have the freedom that I do as a, you know, college professor at a liberal arts college, you know, so so the answer will be different. So I just think I think it's not shying away from them. You know, I think it's not shying away from it. At the very least, we know that there's Black history and we know that we don't know a lot about it, right? That should be, I mean, I'm speaking generally, that should be a starting place, you know? And we have this thing called the Google machine, which allows you to get started, you know, before
Yeah.
you go betray yourself too
Right.
much. So, yeah.
Right.
But that's a question that I struggle with all the time. That
Right.
and Black joy, how you teach Black history and get any Black joy into it. That's a constant struggle.
And a good one. Um,
A
and
vexing
I
one.
think, or a worthy one, I should say.
Yeah.
So that's this is maybe, you know, a nice note to end on. I've really liked what you said too about asking the questions. And I hope that those of us who, I know I will be asking questions of the images that I encounter of Black protest and civic participation, and a wide, and so you've equipped me to do that, and I think others will walk away with the same toolkit to ask those questions. So thank you so much. A warm round of applause from those of us who can't be heard, but I know are there with appreciation. And I see some lovely thanks coming into the chat. So thank you so much, Brenna. And thanks to those of you who are here. We will share the recording with everyone via email and when it's ready. And also share it with some students at the Natick high schools who are too busy to be here, right? So, but they'll have access to it. So,
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Of course. Have a good night, everybody.